I just wanted to remind everybody on the webinar today that it's going to be recorded. So if you want to revisit the conversation, please go back to the network, to the events tab that you just entered the webinar on, and the recording should be posted by tomorrow. And then as we move through the presentations today and you have any clarification questions, feel free to ask those in the chat box. And we will try to respond to any of those questions as we're going, but we are holding 15, 20 minutes or so at the end of the webinar for a larger discussion. So we want to encourage people to turn on their cameras at the end of that. And if you have a bigger question that might warrant more time, hold it to the end. So it looks like we've got most of the people in the room. So I'd like to start out with acknowledging that I am actually joining you from my home office located on the traditional lands of the Shasta and Winnemem-Wintu people. And I want to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and future who have been the custodians of these lands and waters. The Shasta and the Winnemem-Wintu people reside around and on the slopes of Mount Shasta, and whose traditional lands straddle two of the largest watersheds here in the Pacific Coast, the Sacramento and the Klamath River. And with that, I wanted to reflect a little bit about this idea of water acquisitions and valuations, and how it has, shaped my career. Over the 15 years or so of working with environmental water transactions, the question about the value of water often comes up. And in 2009, I was working with the Conservancy in developing the Shasta River Fall Flow Program, and we really had to figure out what fair market value is on water that we were leasing from agricultural water right holders to improve flows for migrating fall Chinook. And since that time, we've seen an increased number of public grant programs that are also interested in acquiring environmental water rights here in California, like WCB's Prop 1 Streamflow Enhancement Program. And, but getting to the answer of how one goes about valuing a water right is complex, and especially in those places where the market of these types of transactions is pretty nascent. In many of our smaller watersheds, the idea of a water market is pretty new. So how do you go about determining what fair market value is on a water right? What factors are considered? Who does this work? And what are some of the challenges that comes with it? So today we're going to try to drill down on try to get to some of those questions, but we recognize that there's going to be a lot more to talk about than what we have time for. So we are actively working on bringing to you future webinars that will continue to drill down into this topic area, and would love to and are soliciting your input on the network as to what questions you have, what challenges have you encountered when it comes to valuation, and how have you overcome those. So share with us your thoughts, and we'll bring you further content as we go along. And then the last thing I just want to mention is we're going to talk a lot about monetizing water and fair market value of water. But I think, just want to recognize and put out there that the true value of water isn't reflected monetarily in a market. There's a value of water when it comes to the environment, to cultures, to society, health, environmental justice, and more. And so while we're focusing on the fair market value and the monetization of water, I wanted to make sure that we all acknowledge that there is so much more value to water that isn't reflected in our markets today. And with that, we're going to hear from some of the leading experts in this area that are going to provide us with an overview of what environmental water transactions are and how water markets in California influence the valuation of environmental focused water right acquisitions, and how they go about valuing the water rights and what some of the common challenges are that they confront. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today from WestWater Research, which is one of the leading economic consulting firms specializing in water market research, pricing, advisory, and trading. And WestWater is also the exclusive data provider as of 2019 for the NASDAQ Bellas California Water Index, which tracks the spot price for California water entitlements. Our first speaker is Bryce McAteer. He's an associate in WestWater's Sacramento office, and he assists public, private, and NGO clients in addressing the challenges related to water resources supply and management. And our second speaker is Harry Seeley. Harry is a principal at WestWater Research and has 20 years of experience in agriculture and water resource economic analysis. He's supported numerous of environmental water practitioners and myself across the West in environmental water transactions and is a seasoned veteran when it comes to identifying creative solutions that secure and protect environmental flows. And so with that, Bryce, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Amy, for that very kind introduction, and all of you here today. We at WestWater are excited to give you a brief overview of California's water markets and talk about both the environmental market and, importantly, the subject of valuation and how we've supported and how other entities can consider, approaching the value of water as they develop different programs to either support, in-stream flows or other environmental objectives. We at WestWater have been around now for 20 plus years and very often have supported many NGO clients, TNC, and perhaps some of you other folks on the line here as well in accomplishing a lot of your environmental goals. So we're excited to kind of highlight a couple of those examples as well as we go through the presentation. And joining me and kind of leading the valuation section of our presentation will be Harry Seeley. I myself am based out of our Sacramento office. I come from a background of having worked in both the agricultural private equity sector, the nonprofit sector with EDF, and formerly was also a general manager for one of the new groundwater sustainability agencies, which many of you may be familiar with as a result of SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And so I've taken those skills and am excited to continue to support WestWater and support its clients with our work here. So I'm going to take us through kind of the initial section of this presentation, which is focused on really water market activity in California and transactions. The objective of this part of the presentation is to provide you with a brief overview of California's water market. We hear that a lot. We hear the water market in a number of different ways, oftentimes through news media or other folks. So I want to give you kind of a brief overview of what that actually looks like, and then focus us in on the environmental market and provide some examples of different environmental water market and transfer programs. After that, I'll hand it off to Harry, and he'll talk through how water is valued in these environmental programs and considerations to keep in mind if you're thinking about valuing a water resource or water asset for environmental purposes. So as long as my screen is sharing correctly, we should be jumping into a new slide here that talks about California's water market. And I really just wanted to start with an overview of what is the California water market. When we talk about water transfers and water markets in this state, what's actually going on and what is happening? And it's safe to say that California has arguably the most active water market in the Western United States. There are a lot of features in California that contribute to that. One is connectivity. We have a really well-piped system, both naturally and through developed infrastructure that allows us to move water supplies really around the state, all the way from the north and the north coast through diversions, through the Sacramento River region, down into the Central Valley and across all of Southern California. And so that enables for really dynamic and massive transfer programs that allow different folks to optimize the distribution of supplies around the state. Now, in terms of those markets, not everything is connected. While we do have good distribution systems such as the Central Valley Project or State Water Project, most markets tend to be very local. And so regional differences in supply availability, in demand and types of demand, the assets available, whether that's a pre-1914 right or a contract right or something else, all have an impact on the prices and trading activity observed. In California, we also have a really diverse makeup in terms of the participants. We have individual growers, there are cities, there are tribes, there are wildlife refuges, private companies, and nonprofit organizations, all of whom participate in California's water market in one way, shape, or form. Overall, we as WestWater, we track and observe water market transfers, not only in California, but across the West. In the past 10 years or so, we observed over $4.1 billion of value transacted across the state. And the map on the right just kind of highlights, it's sort of a heat map, the areas of highest activity based off of total dollars spent. As some of you might expect, a lot of that purchasing activity occurs in the South Coast, as well as in the San Joaquin River and Tulare Lake regions. But all across California, we do observe water market activity, although sometimes that activity is very thin, again, depending on the water resources available and the supply and demand factors. Now, to give you a sense of what that looks like, I wanted to provide you with a kind of a brief expression of what these regional differences actually look like. And so the next few sections are going to talk about market participation in terms of who are the buyers in the market, what are the prices that we observe, and what are the volumes that we observe being transferred or have we observed over the last couple of years. And so I've selected just a couple of market regions across California to provide some of that information here. And each of these is really unique in the types of supplies that they have available to them, as well as the different buyers that have demand for water supplies. And that really derives the participation in each of these markets. So for example, in the northern coast, we don't observe really much activity outside of environmental purchases and transfer programs seeking to acquire water supplies for in-stream flows. And so the environmental buying community is really the predominant source of buying volume in that area. When you move to the San Joaquin Valley, it's a really diverse place. You have some of California's most expensive and most valuable cropland. You have nut crops, you have high value veggies, but you also have large communities and large refuges, all of which have differing demands for water supplies. And so the makeup of players in the market there is really diverse, although agriculture kind of drives the majority of the market activity. In Southern California, there's not a lot of agriculture to speak of, nor is there a lot of environmental purchasing activity going on. So all of that activity that we observe is primarily municipal. And as you move out into the South Lahontan area, which is an area that primarily uses groundwater as well as water replaced by the State Water Project, we see a lot of activity both from agriculture as well as the municipal folks out there. The South Lahontan area is known to be the home of two of California's most recent and largest adjudications, such as the Antelope Valley and the Mojave area. And so that's where we see a lot of that interesting activity from those two major buying groups. Now, market prices really reflect the value of the water supply to the different demands in the region. And so these next couple of, these sets of graphs here provide the spot market price on average that we've observed in each of these areas. As I mentioned earlier, some of these areas have a diverse makeup of different buyers, and some areas have a relatively condensed type of buying groups that are active in the area. The San Joaquin Valley, as it responds to water supply availability, which this year, for example, we're looking at 5% allocations on the CVP and around that for the State Water Project. Those prices are quite volatile because they really respond to surface water availability. So in dry years, we see prices go up, and in wet years, we see prices go down. But consistently, environmental buyers tend to pay less than agricultural or municipal community buyers in those areas. Each of these graphs is also on the same scale, so you can also see relatively, the prices that folks are willing to pay on average compared to each other. So for example, if you're in Southern California, on average, you're probably paying a little bit more for your water supplies than you would be in the San Joaquin Valley, though in certain years, you may be paying less depending on those supply and demand dynamics. Up in the northern coast, where there's not really a lot of demand, the prices are relatively low. And in the South Lahontan area, we also observe pretty stable prices. And part of that is due to the effect of replacement water costs, where in these adjudicated basins, folks who pump above and beyond their allocated water supply are able to access replacement water for a set standard rate, which kind of sets the maximum price folks are willing to pay in those markets. Now, these markets also really vary in size, and the total volumes transferred are influenced by local transaction costs. So, if there's not really an easy regulatory transfer program in place to allow you to say, hey, I have surplus water, I'd like to sell this to another entity, then we may not observe as many, the high frequency of transfers that we do in other areas where those transfer programs and regulatory procedures are put in place. In addition, things that influence market demand and the ability for folks to transfer include the types of entitlements that are available. If I have water available, who can I transfer it to and who can actually access this? And of course, supply and demand. And so the different regions, we observe really the majority of California's spot market purchasing activity happening in the San Joaquin Valley. We also observe a decent amount of activity in the Southern California and South Lahontan regions. And the North Coast, where the primary buying entities are environmental, we do see limited activity, but still very notable activity that has tremendous environmental benefits in terms of the benefit folks get by acquiring water supplies for in-stream flows. Now, when talking about water supplies that are transferred, I think it's helpful to kind of conceptualize what are these different assets that we're talking about. Water is water, but there are a lot of different types of water supplies in California that can be traded, that can be transferred. And when developing potentially an environmental acquisition program, it's helpful to keep in mind, what supplies are available and what that actually means for your program. So commonly traded assets in California's market include surface water rights like pre-1914 and post-1914 rights, project water such as water diverted through a contract to the State Water Project or Central Valley Project. We also see groundwater traded. Now, this isn't very common in most of California, but for example, if you're in an adjudicated basin where your groundwater rights have been quantified, we see active markets. In some places, we do see some groundwater transfers in non-adjudicated basins, but usually that's just a replacement cost, where folks say, you have access to groundwater that you can pump and I don't have as good of access, so we'll work it out and I'll reimburse you for that. And we are seeing, as a result of SGMA, the emergence of new SGMA markets where individual GSAs have created groundwater trading and allocation programs, and that is enabling really the emergence of a new groundwater market. Other water supply assets that are traded include stored water. So for example, water that may be stored in a groundwater banking program or behind a reservoir. And then finally, water storage capacity. And in terms of environmental programs that are focused on water storage capacity, I look to the most recent kind of Prop 1 water storage investment program grants, where oftentimes the majority of those programs included some sort of an environmental benefit, where in exchange for getting the grant funding from the state to help them develop, for example, a new groundwater banking program or a surface water storage program, the program was going to dedicate a portion of those stored supplies to help, for example, pulse flows in certain stream systems to benefit the environment during critical periods. And so that is kind of an emergent market. And as we structure different policies in the state, is sort of a new incentive that's being considered to help drive environmental benefit, along with the other multiple benefits that come along with some of these major storage programs. Now, when we acquire water for the environment, that can be done through a number of both short-term as well as long-term methods. And one thing I like to point out is that for environmental buyers or for environmental entities that are, say, active in the water market or would like to acquire supplies for the environment, oftentimes environmental buyers have the advantage of being able to enter into more flexible as well as more creative transaction structures, considering transaction structures that are additive to the overall value of a potential program, and oftentimes non-consumptive in their end use, allowing for multiple uses of the water supply as we help folks think more creatively as we construct these programs. So water supply acquisition doesn't have to be necessarily an outright supply acquisition where you buy fee title the water right or the water supply from a seller, but you can also enter into or develop really creative forbearance and option programs. For example, in a dry year, you've worked with farmers to sign up for an option program where they will opt to forego their use of water during certain periods to ensure that the environment has in-stream flows during those critical periods. Or environmental buyers can fund efficiency improvements. So they develop new supply by improving the overall efficiency of a system. They take that net gain, and that can be dedicated to the environment. Other potential programs include multi-benefit irrigation and groundwater recharge, outright land acquisition, or rotational fallowing programs. And of course, there's plenty more, but I think these kind of help ground us in the sorts of creative programs that environmental buyers historically in California have considered and implemented to dedicate water supplies to the environment. Now, the next couple of slides are going to focus just briefly on a couple of example programs that kind of highlight these different examples. And of course, if you guys have any other questions, happy to answer those as we get into the Q&A section of the presentation. So the first program I want to start with is kind of a transactional program that Oakdale Irrigation District and South San Joaquin Irrigation District have participated in recently in the last couple of years. Both of these districts hold water rights on the Stanislaus River. They also hold contracts with the United States Bureau of Reclamation who has obligations to comply with the Endangered Species Act and State Water Resource Control Board Decision 1641. And so recently, in a couple of years, through spot market transactions, Oakdale Irrigation District and South San Joaquin Irrigation District have supported USBR in meeting their flow objectives in the San Joaquin River by releasing water supplies. But they've done so in a collaborative way where they've also partnered with DWR and the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority to purchase those supplies so that they can have multiple uses. So as those water supplies are pulsed through the Stanislaus River and then the San Joaquin River to benefit migratory fish, as those molecules of water kind of enter the delta, they then can be rediverted by DWR and San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority to support other water users south of the delta, such as growers on the west side, folks in Kern County, as well as Southern California and the Central Coast. Another program example includes the Bird Returns Program, which TNC has been doing in collaboration with Calusa Groundwater Authority. This program is focused on developing kind of short-term additional habitat for migratory birds in the Sacramento Valley that are associated with the Pacific Flyway. And they do so by acquiring grower commitments to irrigate and maintain water supplies on their fields during water scarce periods. So really during the late summer and early fall. So in exchange for compensation, these growers will irrigate their fields. They'll keep water at a certain level to support waterfowl coming through on the Pacific Flyway. And it's really been beneficial not only to the bird habitat and increasing temporary bird habitat, but also offering opportunities for groundwater recharge, which is becoming so important now in the age of Sigma. The final program I wanted to highlight are programs in the Shasta River Valley. Now, the Shasta River Valley is critical for salmon and steelhead that consider that their spawning habitat. And so NGOs have been active in this area to support both seasonal forbearance programs as well as improving irrigation efficiency to dedicate water supplies permanently through Section 1707 of the California Water Code. You can see on the right both a map of where the Shasta River Valley is, as well as a chart on the bottom which describes kind of the prices that are observed for those forbearance programs. Now, the assets that are traded include pre-1914 water rights, post-1914 water rights, as well as riparian rights. And the sellers include everybody from ranchers to local farmers to local districts, but the majority of that activity is driven by the environmental NGOs that are supporting those in-stream flow efforts in the Shasta River area. I know that was probably a lot of information that looking to kind of provide a synopsis and a summary of California's water market and examples of active programs that different environmental entities have been participating in. But I hope you find that helpful. And of course, if you have any additional questions, looking forward to those as we get to the end of the presentation. But I'll hand it off to Harry, and he can talk us through what it looks like to value these water supplies.
Great, thanks, Bryce, and thanks everyone for joining today. I think, one important thing that's going to kind of carry through this valuation section of the presentation is just highlighting the diversity of the markets in California and the participants and the resulting prices that we see for water rights or water entitlements. And I'll try to illustrate some of that through different examples. But kind of echoing an earlier statement from Amy, it's important to ask the question, what is it that we're valuing here? And there are many ways to sort of think about the value of water. As Amy mentioned, there's societal value, there's cultural values for water, but what we're focused on here really is valuing the water right or entitlement based upon the exercise of the ownership of that right. So really, it comes down to what is the value of water for out-of-stream uses, or conversely, what's foregone as far as economic value by releasing water or not diverting water and keeping it in stream. So importantly, that doesn't consider the monetary value of endangered species protection, for example. It doesn't consider tribal values. Those are certainly important important values for water, but generally fit more in the context of economic studies that look at the allocation of public funding, say, for example, to certain programs to help benefit the environment. So at the end of the day, what we're looking at here is the negotiated value as an estimate of fair market value, which is really represented by, what would a reasonably informed buyer pay a reasonably informed seller within the marketplace. So some key considerations here. These are questions that we ask ourselves here at WestWater whenever we start a new valuation project. One of the more important questions to answer early in the project is, where can the water be moved, either through the regulatory process or physically? As Bryce mentioned, in California, there's quite a bit of infrastructure that can move water really from north to south and from east to west. But that doesn't always mean that you can move water from the North Coast to Southern California, for example. And that ability to, or the constraints on the ability to move water really need to factor into the valuation in terms of the market data that you then apply to value a particular transaction. Another important question, which is, I think, less relevant in California than elsewhere, is to ask, whether or not there's unallocated water available in the region. So, for example, we work throughout the West, and there are, surprisingly enough, still rivers and groundwater systems where there is additional water available for entities to use, either through the traditional state regulatory process, or in some cases there is no regulation of that particular source of water. So, prior to SGMA, this was certainly an important consideration in valuing water rights in California, particularly for those areas where both surface and groundwater were being used together, and there were an ability to do what's called a groundwater substitution transfer. So essentially pump groundwater in lieu of use of your surface water entitlement. And so how does that factor into pricing and valuation for a particular water right? Third here is the water reliability. So many water rights have different priority dates, or are just rights to different systems that have varying physical reliability of water supply. And that's a critically important valuation component to think about. If a water right has obviously less reliability because it's a junior priority date water right, you want to make sure that you're factoring that into the valuation. Many of the environmental transactions that have occurred in California occur in areas where there is limited sort of out-of-stream demand for water rights separate from land. And so that that really factors into the valuation, because you need to think about really what are the alternative uses that a particular water right can be applied to. So, for example, there's not always an LA or a large municipality downstream that is potentially interested in acquiring that water. There may not even be any demonstrated market demand for water rights for agricultural uses apart from land transactions. And so working through kind of the list of potential alternative uses in a market region for a water right is another important step in the valuation process. as is looking at the size of the water rights you may be valuing as it pertains to the different demands in that market. And then lastly, the terms of the proposed transaction. So environmental water transactions can be particularly complicated because of the creative ways in which they are structured, as Bryce kind of illustrated in some of his slides. You know, it's not always I'm going to buy your water right, dry your land up, and move the water right to a new place and purpose of use. It can be, hey, I just want to help you improve the efficiency of your water use on your land and leave that non-consumptive water savings in stream to benefit a particular reach of a river. And so, you know, thinking about the transaction type and the character of the water that's generated for in-stream flow can help to influence the type of valuation, the type of market data, and the valuation approach that you select. So just talking about some of those valuation approaches here, you know, in general, there's 4 main approaches that get applied. The traditional sales comparison approach, so where there are market transactions of water rights separate from land, you know, that's definitely the preferred approach to valuing water rights if that fits with the transaction structure that you're pursuing. Income capitalization approach. This is really trying to understand what the value is, the value of the water is to its current use. So for the easiest way to think about this is what's the value in agricultural use? So if I'm growing alfalfa hay, for example, if I choose to give up 2 acre-feet during an irrigation season, what does that do to my production? And how does that translate into a reduction in my net income from hay sales in that particular year? The cost replacement approach is another approach that commonly gets applied in environmental transactions, again, because of the creative and flexible structures that are often pursued. It's really should be applied as a least cost alternative. So for example, if you are trying to look at the value of a particular water resource in stream, and you really don't have the ability to acquire water rights from agricultural users, you may be looking at other options, which can include groundwater recharge to help benefit stream flows, reservoir releases. So the important thing is to ask, what are the least cost alternatives within a specific market region? Are those actually, are they actionable alternatives? And what are the costs of those to implement as an alternative to the particular project that you may be pursuing? And then lastly, land price differential. This approach really just looks at the incremental value that water rights contribute to land sales. It's an approach that often applies the bottom line value for irrigation purposes and is useful in markets where there is really limited water right transactions. So just quickly here, this little matrix just shows, you know, from our perspective, which of the 4 valuation approaches apply best to the different transaction structures that you might pursue for environmental purposes. Obviously, comparable sales works for everything, but you can see that some of these other approaches don't always apply as easily to the different types of transactions you may be looking at. So I just want to go through a couple of case studies here to kind of illustrate the process that that is used to value water rights. Again, in this context, a limited market. The Upper Klamath Basin, there really is a very limited history of permanent water right transactions, and really no water right transactions separate from land for anything other than environmental or in-stream flows. So there's no urban demand. There's really no agricultural entities that are actively purchasing or leasing water supplies for agricultural uses. So in the context of a limited market, what we found is that the most important thing to do that you can do for a valuation project is to implement multiple approaches. So in this case, we looked at comparable sales as well as land sales. So the charts on the bottom really just show kind of the limited history of transactions in the basin. You can see there's very few permanent sales or long-term sales of water rights, while at the same time, you have some leasing activity illustrated over here, but it applies to a specific portion of the basin where it's not relevant to every subbasin in the region. To complicate matters, we have this nice line showing lease prices related to overall water supply for the Upper Klamath, for the Klamath project. Kind of follows the trend you would expect. But then we had a couple of transactions that were way outside of the historic trend. And so this, again, I think was the reason why we felt the need to implement multiple valuation approaches to really help us bracket what the values might be, or what the estimated values are for water entitlements in the basin. So just real quickly here, estimated two different types of land price differential approaches. The first is kind of a more simple one where we look at the value per acre of land as it relates to the percent of that land transaction that is water righted. So how much of that sale is covered by a water right. You can see there's an upward trend in the data. And this particular trend line indicates, each acre of land with a water right is worth about $2,200 more than acres of land without water rights. And then in a different part of the basin, we applied a similar approach, but used a more statistical regression analysis to get at the same question. In this case, we were able to do something a little more rigorous with regression analysis because we had more transactions and data to support it. And then this is a Mill Creek transaction tributary to the Sacramento Basin. Again, market region was the important question here. So because we're in the Sacramento Basin, does that mean I can sell my water to the San Joaquin Valley or the Bay Area or Southern California? And in this case, at the time, there was a lot of uncertainty around the ability to move water legally outside of the Mill Creek Basin. So we were asked to consider, okay, well, what is the value if you can only keep the water right in the basin versus what is the value if it's actually transferable outside of the basin? So importantly here, again, this goes back to the market region. What's really relevant to consider as far as market data? There's never been at the time, and still, to my knowledge, there's never been a permanent transfer of a pre-14 water right through the Delta. Because of the conveyance window limits, moving water north to south through the Delta, and the lack of storage associated with, generally lack of storage associated with pre-1914 water rights, there's really no ability to kind of time to get the time to move the water from north to south through the Delta. So our conclusion here was that the market is limited to in-basin use for potential lease or sale in the Sacramento Valley only. And then last, real quickly here, quantification. This comes up all the time, and often can be a real indicator early on in a transaction, whether or not you're dealing with a savvy water right owner or one that has really sort of pie in the sky expectations about what their water may be worth. This is an example from Battle Creek. It's a pre-1914 water right for 50 CFS. The water right, like a lot of old water rights, doesn't have an annual volume limit attached to it. Doesn't even have a season of use really specified in the decree. And so the owner in this case was marketing the water right based upon the historic diversion volume through an unmanaged ditch system. And that resulted in really a volume that amounted to almost 50 acre-feet per acre that he wanted to get paid for. And so really the quantification process in terms of what waters can be valued in a transaction, it's just not well understood by all parties to a transaction, and is often the first hurdle that you need to address in a, in your case, maybe a negotiation, but in our case, in the valuation exercise. So often that involves, and just pretty quickly, some of the issues that affect the quantification is the cropping pattern. So what's the historic consumptive use associated with the property? Is there sub-irrigation for some areas, like in the Delta? That's a big issue. And are there non-use or crop fallowing that occurs on that particular land that needs to be accounted for as part of the transaction and the quantification of the marketable volume? I know that was pretty quick. Hopefully we have some time for questions, and happy to address any questions that come up.
That's great, Harry. Thank you, Bryce. Thanks so much. Folks, so bring your questions forward if you have any. I don't see any in the chat. We'd love to see you on your screen if you can. I recognize it's the lunch hour, so if you're eating, that's fine. And we'd love to hear you ask your questions if you can. Here's one in the comment box. When there is an agreed transaction, how are the actual quantities ground truth? That is the water measured and determined in stream.
Yeah, I can give that a shot. So typically that's done through the regulatory process. So often a transaction will be structured so that payment is contingent upon the volume that's actually approved for a new use, in this case, in stream. So let's say you and the landowner or water right owner agree that $1,000 an acre foot is the correct price, but the only uncertainty is how many acre feet are going to be applied to those particular terms. And you can go through the process of estimating, using sort of state guidelines, how much water will be transferred in stream or to a new use. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the state Water Resources Control Board or county courts to decide how much volume is going to be moved.
Yeah, and I think I'd just add to that too, if there is a third party, and this perhaps is less common for environmental transfers and more common for other water transfers, but for example, if there's a third party that's enabling for the use of their conveyance facilities, an example might be, the state water project where one contractor is purchasing from another. Those entitlements, there's conveyance agreements where DWR essentially is the one that authorizes how much water can be transferred and go from one entity to another. Or if you're doing north of Delta to south of Delta transfers, as folks are doing this year, as a result of dry conditions, those are oftentimes contingent upon conveyance agreements, which include a monitoring program, mitigation programs, and then real-time calculation of Delta carriage losses to ensure that the flows that are coming through and being exported from north of Delta to south of Delta don't negatively affect the environmental conditions within the Delta itself.
That's great. So we have a question from Michael, and then Matt, we'll go to you. I see your hand up. So Michael was asking about the outlier purchases in the Klamath Basin and whether they were privately or publicly funded, and any idea why the discrepancy between the prices.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So those were public funded transactions. There's been a number of years in which either Bureau of Reclamation or other entities have leased water from the project for environmental uses. And, in the last couple years, those programs operated. There was quite a bit of urgency on the part of the reclamation and the environmental users, in that case, the refuge, to obtain water. And that was the negotiated pricing. So it's really just a large increase in the market value for water, and time will tell whether or not that's going to persist.
Great. Matt, you have your hand raised.
Sure thing. So Harry, Matt Clifford from Trout Unlimited. I noticed in your list of things, like your bullet list of things that affect the value of water right, you didn't have anything in there for kind of the legal, I don't know how to do the right word for this, legal validity or legal certainty of the water right claim. And I know, like, I've been saying this a lot lately, but like when you buy land, right, there's a whole system of title insurance and recording and things that's designed to provide absolute certainty that the person claiming this piece of land actually has a good claim. Mm-hmm. And you know that. And in water, it seems like that's often not the case. You might have someone that's been using water for a very long time under what looks like a very secure, like pre-14 or riparian claim, but it's never really been tested. And it might be tested by some of the some of the transactional procedures that are going to follow one of these purchases. And is there any way to reflect? I mean, I assume that has to get reflected somewhere in the value. Like if there are clouds on that, then that water right's worth less to somebody, or someone might want to consider paying less for that right. But is there just no way to reflect that in an appraisal? That's just a separate issue that you note, and it's a question for negotiation, or is there anything there, or am I just missing something and that's not an issue?
No, that's a good question, Matt. And as I mentioned before, it's not uncommon for a transaction to be structured so that the risk associated with the volume of a water right is really transferred to the seller. So if they don't end up having as much as they think they have, they don't get paid for. They don't get paid for that. So, but in the context where you're maybe buying water right as is, and hoping to maybe use it for a different purpose down the road, you as a buyer are taking on that risk. And we just completed and there's many projects like this, but we completed a project where in Arizona where we were asked to look at that very question, and there was a lot of uncertainty about the adjudication wasn't completed. There was groundwater issues in terms of subflow. There a number of factors influencing our view on the validity of that water right and the ability to potentially move that water right from its current use to a new use. And as a result of that, we took a fairly conservative approach on both the quantification question, so how much volume is there, and the valuation, so what's the unit price we applied to that water right. So is it an exact science? I'm not going to say that it is, but there certainly is a scale in terms of value that gets applied to a water right based upon what's known about its historic use and its extent and validity.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
Any other questions out there?
I think I'm a little curious about, you said earlier on about how water rights that are, let's say in the case of forbearance, the value of that forbearance is quantified in terms of the out of the creek uses. Have you seen anything about how people are trying to value in the creek uses?
Yeah, that's a good question. The only context that I have seen valuing sort of in-stream flows in a sort of holistic sense is in the economics literature, not in a kind of a transaction specific valuation project. So I just don't think we've gotten there yet. The water right valuation is, sometimes esoteric and hard enough. Valuing water in stream is a whole other level of difficulty that I just don't think we're ready for or have the data for yet.
Thanks.
Hey, Harry, Andrew, just a follow-up question on Tim's question. Do you think some of the dynamics at play, say in the reclamation case with Project Water and the Klamath, is almost an indirect acknowledgement of conservation or environmental values? In other words, a sense that, the situation at the refuge is so dire, therefore we need to pay more in order to help the refuge, without actually doing that quantification of what water is worth to birds or to fish or some such?
Well, I think that's I would like to think that's the case. Yeah, I think what's happened more often than not, if looking at the Klamath or some of the refuge acquisitions in the Central Valley, what you see is that what they can pay is budget constrained. So they don't really have, oftentimes their program doesn't allow them to pay what the market demands for water. Now in the Klamath, in the more recent instance, I would argue it's almost the opposite, that what they had available to them through drought funding drove the unit price they were willing to pay. But, it's a little chicken and egg argument. I do think there definitely was, and it continues to be, urgency to acquire water for the environment in the Klamath Basin, and a lot of pressure to get that done. And so it's ultimately going to be reflected in the unit price.
Any last questions? Okay, well, Michael, you have one. Let's go ahead for your question and then we'll close out.
This may be too much for a last question. I'm really struck by Matt's comment earlier, because in essence, what I think I'm hearing is you're appraisers, but there's no title company. And that's worrisome when we're talking about the commodification of a public resource. And so I guess, to the sense that I can distill down a question, one could argue that the value of privately traded water is uncertain because of a failure of leadership of government, right? There's tribal trust resources that aren't being adhered to, there are equity issues galore, and so forth. And so I guess the question I have for you is, how do you, in your valuation, incorporate the uncertainty associated with that failure of government?
Well, I can try. I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question very well, but there was a time that there were title companies for water rights, and there still are some out there. They're just few and far between, and kind of the guarantees that they provide are limited. So you know, I think it's a gap in the market that needs to get filled, and it's certainly you know, if as a buyer you can't have any certainty about what it is that you're buying, you know, it's going to continue to limit the potential for market transactions for all uses, including environmental. So you know, I'm hopeful that that gap gets filled down the road. We just haven't seen a title company step up to the level needed at this point.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that too, you know, it really depends on the water entitlement that you're valuing and looking at. You know, some states even have really robust programs and have very systematic methods by which they regulate water supplies. I look just to our neighbor, Nevada, where, you know, if you're a water right holder, you own that, it's recorded with the state. There is a process that's relatively systematic just about anywhere you are. And you record your transfer. You're supposed to record your transfer with the state. So there are good records for those things. Or in California, for example, if you're, say, in an adjudicated basin, those water rights are, you know, you're a party to a court agreement and to a settlement agreement. And so there is good recordation of who owns what and who is the title holder. But particularly for some of the older water rights, it's a lot tougher, and that really gets kind of placed into the valuation process. And I think it comes down to what Harry said earlier about contingencies, and a lot of these agreements have to have relatively robust contingencies to identify, you know, whether or not this transaction will actually go through. And those are all a part of the process. But I think there continues to be a large interest in finding better ways to understand the water rights that we hold and clarifying those things. And I think that will be beneficial for all water right holders and beneficial uses and users.
That's great. Okay, well, we're at the end of our hour. Take a look at up and coming webinars coming up in May and June. We're going to switch things up about happy hour. So instead of a 4 o'clock happy hour, we're doing a social lunch next week, so we can continue this conversation next Thursday if you're interested, or we can talk about anything else. And I just wanted to say thank you so much. I think these are really valuable conversations to be having, and a lot of important questions. So as you have more questions throughout the next week or days, you know, put them into the network. Let's start a dialogue about this and continue the conversation. And with that, everybody have a fabulous Tuesday afternoon. And thank you, Harry and Bryce, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I see an applause coming from Neil. And anyway, thank you very much. And I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.